The Sinner is not your standard psychological thriller because it's a why-done-it as opposed to a who-done-it. It's a fascinating exploration of psychology, trauma, mental illness, violence, and motivation. I'm Rob LaCouria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with the show's creator and showrunner, Derek Simonds. Derek, I'm sure that you've gone down this road before, but talk us through how The Sinner uniquely focuses on the psychology of crime.
Yeah, I mean, that was the aspect of the show that really intrigued me from the start. Unlike a lot of procedural dramas and mysteries, The Sinner, you learn at the very beginning of the season who committed the crime and how and where and to whom. But the motive, the why, is always the mystery, and that's something that we explore and continually unfolds throughout the season. And it gives us a great opportunity to really focus on psychology and the psyche of the characters. And a lot of times the plot and the story develops not so much from outward clues and evidence, but rather a revelation about the main character, the criminal, and seeing their psychological process in a new light.
You know, sometimes with this show, I even find like the major or the crime that we're looking at sometimes takes a second fiddle to what's going on in Ambrose's head or the head of the main character and what's motivating them. I find that so interesting. And in fact, if we think about the Ambrose character played by Bill Pullman, by season 3 he feels so lived in. The limp and the way he looks at people like he's literally in pain. I just found his performance like a revelation to me, and I just was wondering, how did it come about that he would stay on as the show's main central character that kind of links the seasons together?
Yeah, well, in today's TV environment, even when you're making a limited series, there's always the question, in success, what would happen if we wanted to continue the story. And we started the series based on a book by a German writer, Petra Hammesfahr, called The Sinner. And the Ambrose character was less developed in the book. It was much more about Cora, the character played by Jessica Biel in season 1. And it was my idea to turn that season into more of a two-hander than just being in Cora's point of view. And with that, there were just more and more questions of who is this character, who is Ambrose? And it got more and more interesting to me that he was someone who related to personally the trauma that Cora went through, and that was part of his interest in understanding what happened to her. So when that relationship got more and more fortified and developed, we really realized as we were going out to sell the show that Ambrose was the perfect vehicle to link, being the investigator, to link all these seasons together if we were successful enough to be renewed. And that we would follow this model that we've been actually following pretty faithfully, which is that every season presents a new kind of guest star character who is the criminal that Ambrose enters into a unconventional relationship with, and also tries to solve the mystery around.
From previous seasons, we had glimpses of him being a masochist. Well, not even glimpses. Like there was some. It was pretty overtly obvious that he was a masochist and seriously damaged from his upbringing. In season 3, he says he doesn't take pills, and then he's called out for preferring the pain, and it immediately made me realize or remember that that's who this guy is deep down. Why does that angle interest you in a leading man? It's unconventional to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the start with Ambrose, I was very aware of the iconography of the detective and how, from sort of film noir days on forward, the detective is always this kind of hyper masculine, tough guy who doesn't really express his emotions, who's brooding. And Ambrose shares some of those qualities, but I think what fascinated me was bucking that trend and actually making Ambrose very vulnerable, having his superpower not be this crazy intellect, you know, Sherlock Holmes style talent, but rather his empathy, his emotional empathy with the criminals that he encountered. And it was exciting to me to develop a character who is struggling with trauma. I think generally in our culture we don't talk about what we've been through enough. We're very invested in the glossy image, you know, the picture we present to each other. And so I was really interested in creating a character like Ambrose who has these secrets that are very painful, but also lead to a talent in relating to people, and that the show over the course of multiple seasons would really challenge him to open up and process those traumas and realize that there's actually healing and intimacy to be had in processing them, not just avoiding them. So it felt like a fresher approach to an area that we've seen a lot of stories about.
I mean, he literally agrees to being buried alive, and he almost dies. Like that to me, that's ramping up that side of him to 11. Where did that come from, that idea? And can you take us back to the shooting of that particular scene? Because it was extremely harrowing to watch.
Yeah, that was it was funny when we were developing the story for season 3 in the writer's room. We kept, you know, coming back to this compelling idea that Jamie and Nick, you know, Matt Bomer and Chris Messina's characters, when they were younger in college, did this to each other, this burial game, to kind of really feel like they were dying and approaching death, and have the spiritual kind of enlightenment that comes from that. And it was my idea at a certain point where I was like, well, I don't want to see that in flashback between the two boys. I want to see that happen between Jamie and Ambrose, which was our dynamic relationship in the present. So a lot of our writing and the course of that relationship was, how can we get Ambrose and Jamie entwined enough emotionally that, for both emotional purpose and strategic purposes, you know, Ambrose agrees to do that. And the shooting was pretty harrowing. We shot those sequences going into winter in the Northeast here in New York. So we were in like 25-degree nights, you know, in the middle of the night in the forests. Our crews were like bundled up. We had tents with heaters that we would run into to kind of warm up before we went out again to shoot. And it was really, really challenging. I mean, Bill Pullman and Matt Bomer were such pros and really went for it. I think it's definitely a big moment for Ambrose, but I think at the point that he chooses to do it, he realizes he has no other option to sort of regain Jamie's trust and to be inside with him.
Speaking of Matt Bomer, I just think this is the strongest work that he's ever done. And I've seen him in so many projects, but he completely loses himself in this performance. And not that I'm surprised, he's a great actor, but I was so impressed with his performance. I'm wondering if you could talk us through, firstly, his casting and what he brought to this season in particular.
Yeah, I feel so fortunate to have had Matt as a partner in this. He was so committed from the start. In fact, this was the first time aside from working with Jessica Biel, who was attached to the project before we shot anything. Similarly, in season 3, Matt was someone who we were considering when I had just the vaguest idea of who Jamie was as a character. So he came on board very early in the process, really over a couple of conversations that he and I had where I sort of described what I wanted to do. And he was a big fan of the show, so I think he was ready to kind of dive in and trust us. But it was really wonderful because as we were developing Jamie and making choices like what is Jamie's vocation and what does his life look like, we had Matt in mind. And I mean, Matt brings so many qualities to the character. But I think the thing that is really compelling with Matt is that he, like Bill, is not afraid to be vulnerable on screen. And he also has this inherent goodness that kind of emanates from him. So you don't necessarily see the devolution of Jamie coming from a mile away. You actually there's this wholesomeness to Matt that continually, I think, reaches out to an audiences and kind of engages your faith and your relationship to him. And that was really our intent from the start. Like through the whole process, I really was, every effort was made where we don't write off Jamie as just a crazy psycho. I over and over in the writer's room, as we were considering choices in the storytelling, there was always this sort of edict of like, well, we can't have the audience just switch off from him. The minute they switch off, they won't care, and the story loses its gravitas. So it really was about relating to Jamie down to the very last moments where you see him still struggling between this rage and this like boyish need for connection, you know?
Yeah, I kept going back to empathizing with this guy, and I shouldn't have done that necessarily. But it's something about his performance. And like, for example, when you speak about rage, in the penultimate episode in Stairwell at the School, when he explodes in this excruciating primal rage, it was one of my favorite scenes. It was a very simple, very quick scene, but it was unforgettable. Can you take us back to that day on set? Was that a particularly difficult day for him and for cast and crew, or did he kind of just like switch on, switch off? What was that like?
It was really challenging. Actually, I distinctly remember Matt, when that scene was over, he was so relieved, and he kind of looked at me and said really quietly on the set, he was like, that was one of the scariest things I've ever done. I think, you know, accessing that kind of rage, that pent-up rage, you know, on a film set suddenly in front of a group of people is really challenging. And I think even more so for Matt, who I think is such a sort of collected, polite person just by nature. And I think, you know, Matt as an actor probably has an easier time accessing his vulnerability than his anger or aggressiveness. So I think that was a challenge for him, but he did a beautiful job. And we did something kind of scary too, which was that like we let the camera run and let him improv and let it go on like quite a bit longer than was comfortable to see, you know, what would unfold if he just stayed in that state for a while. So there was this incredible, when you watch the raw footage, there's this incredible journey of, you know, rage and then tears and then rage coming back again and then being completely lost. And he really went for it and followed his instincts there. It was beautiful.
I wish we could maybe one day see that footage, because it was trying to behold. I was never expecting that from a Matt Bomer performance, and that's not at all a criticism. It's just not something that I would have expected. Another thing that I find so fascinating about the show, and it's maybe it's an obvious question, but when we're first introduced to Jamie and his relationship and history with Nick, I immediately thought, oh, okay, they must have been lovers in the past. It's something that they're hiding, and it's just something that you go to, and you've seen it before. But that was quickly dispelled as we explore something we don't often see, and this intimate platonic relationship between men. It's not something that we see very often. And in fact, you touched on this earlier about trauma. I think this show has a lot to say about masculinity and men and how they behave. And I'm curious about, you know, what outcomes did you want to get out of this show for the audience in terms of what we might learn about men and their relationships?
Well, I'm so happy you asked that question, because it's really the point of the whole season for me as a writer. So it makes me really happy to be asked that. I was really excited to develop this Nick-Jamie relationship, which is then reflected between Jamie and Ambrose, you know, in the back half of the season. And looking at these, as you said, like platonic, non-erotic relationships that have real, like, intimate intensity to them. And I think often that right now in our culture, we don't really have models for how men can relate to each other. We either have this sort of bro culture posturing, or it's immediately gay and threatening and feminized, and somehow, you know, out of out of acceptability. So there are these kind of two poles, and we don't really see the opportunity for closeness and tenderness between two guys. This idea of soulmates, and so I was really interested in Jamie as a character, as someone who's longing for this kind of connection. Like that's the thing he wants. But it's continually thwarted, or he finds it in sort of dysfunctional ways, like with Nick, the Chris Messina character. And I think the irony is that he's finally getting that kind of communion with Ambrose when he's dying at the end of the season. He's actually kind of reaching his goal, which is this tender moment of complete presence with another man, and feeling not alone, and feeling connected without the sort of other expectations of a romantic relationship or a marriage or any other kind of social contract, but rather, there's something fascinating about a friendship because it's so elective, to choose to be in a friendship with someone, and what you get back is not necessarily the security and sex and of a romantic relationship. It's really what you're feeding into and getting back from another person. And I do hope that it starts conversations about toxic masculinity and how our views of masculinity are keeping these kinds of intimate connections between men from being possible. And I think it's really what the world needs to mature into. I think it's the cause of a lot of problems we're seeing in politics and culture right now.
Definitely. I think that you're 100% correct. And before we finish up, the men on the show are so well-formed and nuanced, but Jessica Hex also does some really, really interesting work on this show. I've been a fan of hers for years. She's doing some of her best work as well. It took me a while to get a handle on whether she was a force of good or a force of evil, to be honest. I don't know if that was intentional. What were you trying to get out of that character?
Yeah, I was really the Jessica's role as Sonia, the painter, really began as I really wanted Ambrose to have a love interest this season. I really wanted to put him up to the challenge of what the potential for a romantic connection would be, and to have that also be a foil to the kind of connection that he has with Jamie. And as we developed that character and involved Sonia into the mystery and the situation, the story, I really saw that there was this kind of love triangle between Jamie, Ambrose, and Sonia. And but what I found was that Sonia and Ambrose are both seeing the same thing in Jamie, this character who's struggling and asking these really pointed questions about what it is to be alive and how to connect. And they're both kind of enamored of him. He jostles them both in quite similar ways, which is why I felt so fitting to end the season with the two of them talking about Jamie and dealing with the emotional fallout of that. But I really, she was, her story to me is less, I think it's funny, a lot of people in sort of user comments and viewer comments have said like they thought maybe she was suspicious. I think some of that is just Jessica's manner, which I love so much, which is sort of blunt quality to the character that we love, that we felt was such a good foil for Ambrose's skittishness. That she's just very straightforward and she'll make things pass and she'll put him in uncomfortable situations. So it was really fun to have that energy bump up against Ambrose. But by the end of the season, it's really about her own loss of control. The way Jamie has kind of disrupted her life and reminded her that like mortality is just around the corner at any moment, and her inability to sort of accept that and actually want to get closer to it, to understand it. So there's this kind of almost erotic connection with Jamie, but it's a philosophical one as well, kind of like a moth's, drawing closer and closer to this flame and trying not to get burnt, but really wanting to peek into what that void is that Jamie is in the middle of,
Yeah, it was integral to the season, her role, and I never thought that would have been the case, but it certainly was. Now, finally, before we let you go, are we going to get more seasons of this show? How close are we to a pickup for season 4, please?
I'm just waiting to hear right now, so I don't have any information about that. But
okay. Well, we just have to have our fingers crossed and hope for the best, I suppose. That's how we'll leave it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Derek, thanks so much for your time today. Thanks for freaking us out for season 3. It was certainly an interesting ride and very enjoyable, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much. It's nice talking to you.
Everyone go to Gold Derby, make your predictions, click subscribe, watch all of our chats. There's heaps of them, and we've got plenty more to come, and stick with Gold Derby.